We come in at the right moment. I was just acknowledging Peter's leadership, which has been key to the centre and certainly to the work that I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to try to focus in a bit more on the idea of both attachment and mentalization as likely common factors in therapeutic work, including in psychoanalysis. And to think a little bit, really it'll just be a sort of sketching of a landscape about different ways in which these factors may operate in a clinical context and specifically within a psychoanalytic intensive psychotherapy context. And the three ideas that I'll just refer to really are the addressing of representational distortions, the strengthening of mental processes and capacities for dealing with the social world, including the internal social world, and the currency of so-called embodied cognition, which comes into any sort of psychotherapy but is particularly occurrent in a longer term and intensive therapeutic exchange. And the way in which a framework of psychotherapy, particularly a very consistent and long-term individual psychotherapy, allows space for change in good circumstances. But I also want to emphasise, which I will say at various points, that it's no good, and Peter referred to this as well actually, it's no good just changing within a therapeutic relationship and within a therapeutic framework if that doesn't generalise to life and allow somebody to function better in life and also to learn from other people in life in addition to the therapist, then the therapy has effectively failed, I think. So that's a very sobering thing that we need to keep in mind. So why would we even want to think about common factors across psychotherapies, not just psychodynamic therapies but all kinds of talking therapies? And again, Peter emphasised the multiplicity of approaches to psychotherapy which suggests that there must be some underlying mechanisms. Apart from that clear starting point, there's also a lot of evidence that some therapists in any kind of therapy are much better, more effective than others. And that's obvious, but at the same time it's thought-provoking. What makes a good therapist? What makes a less good one less good? And are there mechanisms which we could really specifically focus on in training people to do kinds of therapy that might allow all therapists to get better and to get better results across patients? While at the same time, another thing that I think is really important to remember, as well as recognising that a whole variety of therapies may be effective, I think we need to recognise that we perhaps need to maintain diversity of therapies in order to find the one that is most useful, relevant and credible for any particular patient, family or group. So I believe that we actually need to have more than one kind of therapy to suit different circumstances, and that makes it all the more important to try to zone in on what actually works in these different ways of working. So demonstrating an evidence base, which I think is really important, and many people in this centre and some of you have been involved in that, doesn't necessarily explain how an effective therapy actually is effective and what the mechanisms are, either the mechanisms underlying the psychopathology which needs treatment and or the mechanisms underlying the therapeutic action. So we shouldn't assume that, for example, CBT works through changing cognitions and altering behaviour. There may be underlying mechanisms which actually mediate that and which are the key to change. If we know better what works, we could, in principle, focus on strategies that actually specifically optimise those mechanisms and which optimise generalisation from the therapeutic context to the rest of life, which are then mediators of the effective treatment which need to be retained and not eliminated, say, in a shorter version or in a manualisation that that may not emphasise it. So we need to be very clear what are the key things in a therapy, and also identify moderators, so things that might mean that a different way of delivering the same change process might be more helpful in this particular context. So in terms of thinking about mechanisms of disorder, we can differentiate between mental processes that aren't well enough developed or are inhibited in the mental functioning of an individual, and also representations. So the main problem may be either at the level of how the person is using their mind in general, or the particular thoughts and feelings which are disturbing them, even though their capacities are broadly functioning all right. If we think about the mechanisms of a treatment approach and how a treatment approach might tackle one or other of these kinds of disorder, and we think about the example of mentalization as a concept in thinking about psychotherapies, we can use that concept in different ways, and sometimes these get a bit mixed up, so I thought it might be worth differentiating. That something like mentalization, or for that matter attachment, can be used either as a descriptive or diagnostic term. So, you know, this person needs treatment because they cannot mentalize, or they have very disorganized attachment, for example. Or they can be used as the basis for treatment technique, as an explicit focus of treatment technique that you're trying to enhance attachment or mentalization, probably quite directly. Or as a measure of outcome. And these three things are actually not at all necessarily connected. So you might use, say, mentalization as a measure of outcome, even though it was not the basis of the treatment technique, and it isn't necessarily the way in which you formulated the problem in the first place. So for maximum coherence, you would try to want to line all these up so that you're thinking about the pathology and the technique and the outcome in similar terms. But powerful in other circumstances can be to measure outcome in terms which actually haven't been explicitly focused on in the therapy, and see whether attachment, for example, may be altered by a form of therapy which tackles a different level of the disorder. But the main thing is to be clear in what way you're using a concept in relation to a therapy. I would argue, and I think perhaps this doesn't need emphasising with any of you, that you can think of mentalization as a sort of common currency of talking therapies in general, even the many that don't use the term. CBT thinks about dysfunctional cognitions, for example. Psychoanalysis thinks about unconscious fantasies, but both focus on elaborating subjectivity and the experience of the mental world, and questioning it and allowing it to shift, and questioning the interpretations of experience as well as the content of experience, and getting better at noticing when a perspective has become fixed and counterproductive for that person and needs to be freed up, and is getting in the way of understanding and communication. So most forms of talking therapy, in different ways with different labelling of the process, are doing these things. They are looking at how somebody is thinking and feeling, and trying to get some space into that to allow it to change in the context of the therapeutic relationship. If we think a bit more about specifically how that's happening, very helpfully in Peter's first talk this morning, he talked about the ostensive cueing that allows you to know that you're being taught something in a way. And you could think of that, and he referred to this, you could think of the whole of a psychotherapy process being a kind of heavily cued message or set of messages to the patient. This is something about you. I'm responding to something you just said or you've been telling me about. And I'm not talking about myself here, I'm talking about the way in which you're experiencing things. And I want you to listen to what I'm going to say about that. So you are focusing in very clearly on, hopefully, on what the patient is expressing and reflecting that back in a way that allows it to be better represented in the mind of the patient. So it no longer becomes just how the world is, it becomes the way that they're seeing the world, and that can be a really key shift. So in some forms of therapy, such as psychoanalysis, there'd be a lot of work on how the transference or the image of the analyst is basically a version or a distortion of reality. It's a selective and often very unrealistic experience of that person. And there will be subtle and not so subtle efforts by the patient to try to sort of provoke the relationship to get into the expected pattern, and that is looked at quite explicitly in the therapy. And equally good in terms of increasing mentalization is to look at things that are not expected, that are potentially disruptive to the progress of the therapy, such as misunderstandings between the therapist and the patient, ruptures of the alliance where the patient may feel really let down or even abused in the therapy, and the sense of having lost safety within the relationship. These are very disturbing things that go on, but they're also opportunities for understanding what happened. How did you experience that? What did it mean to you? And it's what it meant often that is the key to both using it to understand more about the person's mental world and helping them to see that there may be other perspectives on it. In the course of therapy, but this eventually should be reversed. Things that are implicit and automatic in the way that the person thinks, that they always think of themselves, for example, as a victim or as inadequate, become more explicit between them and the therapist. So they're sort of disentangled from the background of all the events and experiences that somebody's talking about. A theme is extracted that, you know, in all these different situations you're telling me about, you always seem to come over as in this same, basically the same position in relation to all these different independent people in your life. And things like that, observations like that, are made explicit so that they can be thought about and talked about. And that in itself actually often causes quite a bit of change, because all of us are unaware of most of what we assume. And even just having it identified by somebody and implicitly highlighted as something that we don't necessarily think. So if somebody says, you always seem to feel that you're a victim in every situation, one implication of that is you might not be a victim, or, you know, maybe you seeing yourself like that is something that contributes to the problem. And so it begins to be something that can be thought about and seen as possible to change, not just a fixed piece of reality. So making things more explicit is a very important aspect of any kind of therapy. Elaborating the internal representation, so what's the extent and nature of this distortion, if you like. Connecting the feelings with those thoughts, so when you feel like a victim you feel angry, aggrieved, hopeless, etc. And a better differentiation of self and others, so, you know, you're not glommed together with the people in your life. They have one set of experiences, you have another set of experiences, and the fact that you feel like a victim all the time doesn't necessarily mean that they are abusing or exploiting you. So becoming able to think that possibly one's experience of oneself doesn't imply what the other is doing and what the other is intending. So this kind of decoupling is a really important aspect of developing better mentalization. So the underlying trend in all this is towards questioning, noticing things, questioning them, and becoming brave enough to think about whether there are alternatives. And this is a version of a completely natural process which doesn't happen for everybody, but happens commonly and without any training between parents and children. And I think all of you are familiar with the idea that the way in which a parent treats a baby or a toddler helps that baby or toddler to develop a sense of who they are and of the internality of their mental experience, and to elaborate their picture of themselves and eventually of other people. And this is, I mean, if we think of Inga's toddler groups, for example, this is not something that parents actually need to be told, you know, why don't you say this to your child when he does that. It's normally a relatively intuitive thing, and a lot of it goes on non-verbally, connecting the internal experience and the external world. But in cases where that hasn't gone so well, we need to help somebody do that, even as an adult. So that means, it can mean developing the processes that you need to be able to do that, which is essentially processes of mentalization and representation of the world, that allows the person to populate their internal world to correspond as well as possible to the external world, and to populate it in terms of mental states, so intentions, feelings, and so on. And we see, when we get to know somebody very well in a therapeutic situation, we can see all the time the residues of this process that's gone on in infancy and later. So really ordinary things like how somebody walks across a room, or the tone of voice that they tend to use when they address the other person, the expectations that they appear to come into the room with, can be thought about as residues and clues to what their early experience was, what they learned to expect from being with another person. And we were hearing this morning about Stern's ideas of schemas of a way of being with the other. So what could be, in a way, a clearer example or context in which to see that than a regular meeting between two people, in which there aren't the usual sort of social props and cues and activities that allow you to not to notice the way in which the relationship's being set up. In a psychotherapy and above all in a psychoanalysis, the whole emotional and social context of that therapeutic relationship is created from the structure of the setting combined with the expectations of the patient coming into it. So another thing which is relevant here, and which I'll refer to briefly, is the way in which different modes of relating to your internal world become separated in a therapeutic context, and can become, this can allow them to be changed more easily. So essentially fantasy and a sense of reality or reality testing are somewhat suspended and allowed to be put into relationship to each other within a therapeutic setting. And there's a whole theory about the development of psychic reality in the mental world, which I won't go into now, but it involves becoming able to bridge and articulate fantasy and the sense of external reality in development, such that it becomes possible to see fantasies, wishes, thoughts, assumptions, interpretations in a more flexible relationship to what's really going on out there, particularly the reality of another person. So we can think of neurosis, for example, as a more circumscribed failure of mentalization. So a failure in a particular context, say of an authority relationship, that somebody becomes very inhibited and anxious because of unconscious conflict in relation to authority figures, but they may function pretty well in other contexts of their life. But within that context, the fantasy that they have, for example, that they are rebelling and trying to defeat the authority figure, and this is very dangerous, the fantasy becomes reacted to as though it were an external reality. And perhaps the difficulty of that person in allowing in that reality of their own mind may have an origin in the way in which their parents and others important to them had difficulty in accepting and, if you like, playing with that kind of attitude. So if the parents were very offended and upset by any evidence of rebelliousness on the part of the child may grow up feeling that that's too dangerous and threatens everything else in their world. So what we're seeing is somebody whose mental processes may work pretty well apart from in that salient conflict context, and whose self, other and affect configurations cause distortions in a specific setting. And that the fact that they have generally adequate mentalization capacities and are able to form reasonable attachment relationships enables a much easier therapeutic process of really focusing on particular problem areas rather than the entirety of the person's social functioning. If we think about more pervasive developmental disorders either in children or in adults, we can think about that in terms of a much more general failure, either an inhibition or a distortion of broad, important mental processes that are not available to that child or adult, and which allow the contamination of experience pervasively, contamination by fantasy projection and so on, so that the person needs much broader based and probably more intensive longer term help to correct the assumptions and notice the assumptions in a structured therapeutic context. And the evidence that personality disorders tend to need longer and a more wraparound kind of treatment model is consistent with that. And if that contamination can't be dealt with in a more specific and limited way, the risk is that the person suffering from sort of overwhelming invasion, if you like, by their fantasies and impulses may feel that the only way to contain that and manage it that they've found is through some dramatic physical action, such as self-harm or coercing people in the world around them into fitting in with and reacting to their experience. So if we think about what the psychotherapy or psychoanalytic context allows us to do, first of all it activates the attachment system, so it activates quite a lot of anxiety about being in a close relationship, an open-ended relationship perhaps, intensively with another unknown person. I mean, that's quite a scary thing just on its own. And then what you do within that relationship is focus on the most painful, private, difficult, conflictual things in your life. So it starts off with quite heavy odds against it being a comfortable or sustainable situation. But what may allow that situation to be sustained and be therapeutic is the way in which the frame of an analytic way of working, and I would include any intensive psychotherapy or sustained talking therapy in this, that the regularity and the theoretical framework and the rationale in the therapist's mind and the regular way of working and attitude that they have allows a kind of context to be built up for that patient in which it is safe to express the most disturbing thoughts. And they feel both completely real, for example, in analysis, transference, feelings and wishes may feel not just real, but like the most real thing in the whole of your life and the most intense emotional experiences. At the same time, they're curiously as if, in a sense, because when you go out of the session, half an hour later, or however long it takes you to get over it, you sort of know that isn't really the whole of your life, and it gets back into proportion and into context of other feelings. But within the setting, it feels safe, if you like, to experience something as absolutely real and compelling. And that allows it to be both identified very clearly with the therapist and questioned and understood better. So in a way, the freeing of irrationality to be fully expressed allows it also to be recognised and dealt with, and then hopefully to be reabsorbed in a way that feels more like a representation, more like something you understand now that you thought or you feel, rather than it being, how it is, inevitably. And as I said before, it's important that such changes within the therapeutic relationship can be also generalised outside, so that we can learn from and benefit from other relationships, and not only have to stay in analysis permanently to be able to detoxify our mental experiences. This more or less says the same thing, with the emphasis on the sense of psychic truth and the recognition that that isn't the same as external truth. So something is at the same time validated but also put into context. And you can probably see, without it being spelt out, how this way of recognising and taking seriously, and yet also putting into context and qualifying, it is parallel to one of the things that parents do for children. That they take their children's experience very seriously, at the same time they play it back in a way that puts it into context of an adult understanding of reality, and may allow that child then to process those feelings and keep them in mind without having to act them out in the same way or react to them in the ways that have been causing problems before. I think we don't need to dwell on that. So one thing that I mentioned previously is that the consistency and the restriction, actually, of the analytic setting allows action of a certain kind, mental action, if you like, and verbal action to be expressed and studied in a lot of detail. And we can see from the manner of somebody's way of relating to the analyst and the ways of relating that they describe to other people in their life, to be really studied in terms of what it tells you about what they need to do to a relationship to make it tolerable, or to make it exciting, or to make it feel real. How they need to use another person. And this takes us back to how they were used and how they felt they could use the original attachment relationships. And I'm going to go on to that aspect. So if we think about the drives, Peter mentioned earlier the sexuality and aggression as the sort of primary drives in psychoanalysis, and I think we really need to acknowledge, and I think it's high time that this was recognised within psychoanalytic theory, that attachment actually is a primary biological drive, at least on the same level, and perhaps more fundamental. I would say it is more fundamental than those other drives, which also remain extremely important in life from infancy through to adulthood. So if we add in attachment and attachment experiences as formative biological necessities for an individual to develop, we can see that those early experiences will continue to be expressed unconsciously or non-consciously in adult relationships, including in a therapeutic relationship. And we can begin to understand how, for example, if we feel in a relationship with a patient that we're constantly being pushed out, that the person needs to be left alone, or that they are viscerally frightened of being invaded by us, for example, we can begin to think about what that might represent from their earlier experiences, and how it might be possible to help them to become aware of that and to become able to see that it may no longer be the reality. So the therapist or analyst is tuning in, actually in any form of therapy, to the level of the relationship with the mental world that that patient has arrived at, both in terms of their particular symptoms and more generally in their functioning. Trying to help them to represent that and trying to free the patient from the often extreme alternatives that they felt they needed to stick to previously. Now, if we finally just think about what are the pathways for the kind of deficits that we see in intensive therapies, people with pervasive difficulties, I think it may be worth differentiating three major ways in which these deficits become established in the personality through experience. One is through broad implicit expectations and strategies. So we saw from some of the research that Peter presented, for example, that even though attachment categories, avoidant, resistant, secure, disorganised, are really, really broad and in many ways too broad to be that useful, so that knowing that a baby used to be avoidant, you know, gives you some idea of what you might expect for their later development, but it doesn't really give you a very strong handle on it. But it nevertheless, as the work by Liz Means and others illustrated, can still be quite a powerful predictor of the way in which that child uses information from the external world, and I think that research is incredibly striking. So we can think that what a baby learns in infancy, that he or she needs to do to stay alive, first physically, then emotionally and cognitively, how do they need to restrict themselves and express themselves in order to be safe with the caregiver and get the best out of the caregiver. That early learning of what's safe and what isn't, and what the caregiver wants and can tolerate, continues to have an unconscious effect through later life. And we can think about how that actually works in practice through the concept that Stern's group and Carlin Lyons Ruth in particular have elaborated as implicit relational knowing. So this is the detailed predictions that somebody unconsciously makes or non-consciously makes of how somebody they love and depend on is going to treat them when they're vulnerable, and the kind of shape of relating, including not only vulnerability but how their curiosity and liveliness will be responded to, how everything about what they express to another person will be treated and dealt with by that other person. And we can think about if you like, the internal working models being played out moment by moment in this kind of specific knowing about relationships. We can also think about it in terms of early mirroring interactions, and particularly what's expected by the child and then the adult in terms of the reception of their particular feelings and intentions. How have they felt responded to? Has every time they felt lively and interested and excited about the world, has that been responded to as an aggressive attack by the mother, for example? And that kind of consistent distortion of their authentic feeling and expression becomes internalized as part of the picture of the self, and gives the child a sense of emotional meaning and importance. What matters about them, and what does it mean to another person, and then what does it mean to themselves? And of course these things are much too early to be remembered, so we're deducing it from much later residues of these early experiences. And the third way of patterning this experience of the self, which becomes expressed through embodied cognition and affect, is the way in which the child has or hasn't become able to experience their mental world as a mental world. In other words, to mentalize, particularly within an attachment context. And have they become able to recognise that their experience of the world is an internal state? Have they become able both to fantasise and imagine, but also to know that that's what that is? Have they become able to think about acting on and having helped to act on their mental experiences, other than through physical coercion or, for example, taking substances to manage how you feel? Have they become able to develop an elaborated internal world, in other words? And so finally, I think that we need to remember and actually celebrate the fact that all kinds of talking therapies, including psychoanalysis and its derivatives, are actually in a way professionalizations of natural human emotional and social processes. And those processes of attention, understanding, thinking, negotiation, friendship and even love are processes that can be incorporated in various therapeutic models for communicating with a patient about what is wrong, what is causing them trouble. And that's the same thing that parents do, it's the same thing that people do in adult love relationships and friendships and so on. So psychotherapies in a way are structured and safe ways of doing what we actually do as human beings with each other and with each other's feelings and wishes. And I think it's important that there is a variety of safe and evidence-based packages for doing this with people, and that we learn more about which of these packages actually helps and is acceptable to which particular kinds of patient, but that we recognise that they're all doing versions of the same thing. And also the good news on a day like this, in an occasion like this, is to remember that those processes of understanding each other and communicating are also available in all the original unsafe versions of friendship and attachment to each other, and they also work. So thank you very much.